What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Weedeater brand trimmer, and the problem is it's been kept outside for a long time and now it won't start. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this trimmer. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, I know there's a lot of negative opinions about Weedeater brand equipment, but the one thing that's great about them is they're very light and easy to use. Sure, you're not going to do any heavy-duty trimming with them, but that's not what they were made to do. This one is living up to its reputation, though, but it's really not its fault. It was used on a large lot till one day when the owner had problems with it and put it away. Now, this trimmer was sitting outside for a while, but I'm not sure for how long. It was in a small open shed, so it didn't get rained on, but it did see a lot of moisture, so there's probably going to be some water damage. Now, this thing has small problems here and there, such as a missing primer bulb and old fuel lines, which will probably need to be replaced. More than likely, the carburetor will also need to be serviced as well. Now, the first thing I want to do is check to see if the engine is worn out. The easiest way is to slowly pull on the rope and feel how much the engine fights back. Now, aside from a pull rope that isn't returning correctly, I can feel each compression stroke, and there's a lot of resistance, so the engine still has plenty of life left in it. Now, I want to try and start it, but this is when I find our next problem. The Z-bend on the end of the throttle cable is broken, so it's not going to work the throttle plate. I won't worry about it right now, but I do have a plan to deal with it later on. Fortunately, it ran for a second on the fuel that I put into the carburetor, so just out of curiosity, I want to put some fuel in the tank and try starting it, but that leads us to yet another problem. The tank itself has a lot of deposits in it and on the gas cap as well, so I can't just add fuel into the tank until I clean it out. For me, the easiest way to clean the tank is to rinse it out with old stale gas. Now, you don't have to take off the gas tank, but since I have to redo the fuel lines, it will just be easier with it off of the engine. Now, there are two fuel line sizes. One is the return line and one is the fuel filter line. So which one is which? If you pull up the smaller line, you can see it comes right out. So this is the return line. That means that the larger line is the fuel filter line. I'll take the lines off and empty the tank so I can rinse it out. Now, I usually reuse the fuel filters, but this one is in pretty bad shape, so I don't want to risk it. I'll just have to replace it. Luckily, these are really affordable online. If you want to put some nuts and bolts in the gas to help loosen the debris, that will work too, but this time I'll just use straight gas. You may also have to try this multiple times to get all the debris out of the tank. Now, since the fuel tank is clean, I'll remove the carburetor and inspect it for any problems. Now, when you take the carburetor off the engine, make sure you don't lose this gasket, otherwise the engine might not run or even start. After taking the primer bulb and the pump side off the body of the carburetor, I noticed it's very clean on the inside, which is great news. Now, the pumping diaphragm is also in great shape and definitely reusable. The next thing I want to check is the metering diaphragm for any signs that's beginning to harden. Well, the good news is that it's not hardened up, but the bad news is it's not as pliable as it should be, so it needs to be replaced. Now, these can be bought online for a few dollars a piece. Just make sure it looks exactly like the one you're replacing and that the stem in the middle is the same size. Now, before I replace the metering diaphragm, I need to make sure that fuel will pass through the screen inside the carburetor. Fill the pocket with fuel and press the rocker arm and it should disappear, which this one does. Now, just in case I needed it, I did take the liberty of buying a replacement carburetor kit along with extra parts. Let's see what all I got for only $13. The first thing inside the box are a set of carburetor gaskets if yours happens to get damaged. After that, there's a carburetor adjustment tool, which is nice if you don't have a set of carb tools already. Also inside the box is a set of fuel lines, which is something we desperately need for this project. One is 140 thousandths, while the other one is 188 thousandths of an inch. This kit also includes two new foam air filters, 2 extra primer bulbs, and a no-name spark plug, which I'll only use if I need it. Here's something that we definitely need: 2 fuel filters. Never run your trimmer without a fuel filter, otherwise the screen inside the carburetor will clog up and not allow it to work like it's supposed to. The last thing inside the box, of course, is a brand new carburetor. Now, I'm only going to install this if we have a problem with the original one. If the original one happens to work, I'll just save this one for another project. Now it's time to reassemble the original carburetor along with a new metering diaphragm and a primer bulb. Another reason why this trimmer isn't starting is, of course, severe water damage. Now, since it was outside for some time, water could have damaged the rings or even the cylinder walls, and this would reduce the engine's compression and not allow it to start or run. The next thing to do is to run some new fuel lines. Now, to help get them into the fuel tank, cut the lines at a sharp angle. Once it's inside the tank, use some pliers to pull it into the tank. Now, the smaller line will be the return line, and the larger line will be the fuel filter line. Just make sure there's enough fuel line in the tank to let the filter reach the far side of the tank. After that, I'll put some fuel into the tank and test the original carburetor. Now, to test the original carburetor, I'm going to put the fuel filter line to the lower fuel port and then press the primer bulb to see if it works. Now, the fuel should flow from the tank through the line and fill the bulb, and then leave out of the top port, which of course would be hooked up to the return line. Now, this may take a few presses or it may take a lot of pressing, but once it starts working, it usually works fine afterwards. Okay, it looks like it's finally filling up with some fuel, but there's a big problem. I can feel fuel on my fingers, which is not supposed to happen. Now, if I turn the carburetor around and press the primer bulb, you can see fuel leaking into the carburetor's throat, which is not supposed to happen. To be honest with you, this is where I call it quits when it comes to trying to figure out what's wrong. More than likely, it needs a new carburetor kit, but for the price, I'd rather just buy a completely brand new carburetor instead. So it's a good thing we have a new replacement carburetor from that kit. Just for fun, I'll still test the carburetor to make sure it works like it's supposed to. So the primer bulb is filling up, and if I turn it around, you can see that the new carburetor isn't leaking fuel into the throat like the original one was doing. Next, I'll install it back onto the engine. Now for the broken throttle cable, I'm going to do something that you shouldn't do. I'm going to use a piece of wire to connect the broken end to the carburetor. The reason I'm going to do this is I need to make sure that the trimmer works fine, then I'll buy a replacement throttle cable later on. Now, before I start the engine, I want to make sure that I have some trimmer line in the head. That way, when I make adjustments to the carburetor, I'll have some load from the head. So it started and ran, but it started with the choke in the wrong position, and it didn't run very well, so I need to adjust the carburetor. Now, while it was running, I did turn the idle screw a few times to see if it would help, but unfortunately it didn't do much of anything. The fuel adjustment screws are located at the bottom of the carburetor, and you'll need that special tool that came in the box or buy a set online. And unfortunately, when I tried to use it, it didn't fit. They had put the wrong one in the box. Luckily, I already had a set, and this particular carburetor doesn't require the spline tool, but instead requires the Pac-Man tool. Now, the screw closer to the engine is for adjustments at idle speed and revving the engine up, while the one closer to the air filter is for fuel adjustments when the trigger is fully squeezed. Let's try starting the engine again and see what kind of adjustments we need to make. Now, since it didn't try and start in the fully choked position like it's supposed to, and instead in the half-choked position, that means that there's too much fuel at idle. To deal with that, I'm going to reduce the fuel at idle by turning the left screw clockwise about a quarter turn, and then I'll try starting again and see if it starts a little easier. So it started much easier this time, just like it's supposed to, and it even runs okay when squeezing the trigger. Now, I'm not going to make any adjustments to the screw closer to the air filter until I need to use it on the lawn. I'll also look into the pull rope situation later on if it gets any worse than it actually is. So my question is, would you have just replaced the carburetor in the first place since it was in the kit already, or would you still have tried to service the original one? Was I wasting my time even looking at it, even with a brand new carburetor within arm's reach? Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.